Welcome to Crime Era Channel, where every crime tells a story, the darkest secrets of crime are uncovered, and the hidden truths of criminal underworlds come to light. In the closing years of the 1960s and the dawn of the turbulent 1970s, the United States found itself suspended between cultural upheaval and existential longing. The optimism of post-war prosperity had evaporated. In its place came rising distrust in institutions, political disillusionment, and a collective sense that the old structures no longer provided meaning. Against the backdrop of Vietnam, civil rights struggles, assassinations, and shifting social norms, millions of Americans began to question who they were, individually and as a nation. It was a decade electrified by uncertainty, and uncertainty is fertile soil for ideology. People were not merely searching for better jobs or better neighborhoods. They were searching for identity, for purpose, and for a form of belonging deeper than anything conventional society seemed able to offer. Church attendance declined, traditional authority fractured, and new spiritual movements, alternative religions, and charismatic teachers rushed in to fill the void. The cultural imagination was wide open. Ideas that would once have been dismissed, Eastern mysticism, psychic exploration, UFO visitations, communal living, utopian social experiments, were suddenly embraced by people who felt the world had become too chaotic, too hostile. It was in this climate of collective yearning that two movements, seemingly unrelated yet spiritually parallel, began their ascent. One grew from the fiery sermons of a charismatic preacher promising racial equality and social revolution. The other emerged quietly from the fringes of New Age spirituality, built around the conviction that humanity was on the brink of a cosmic transformation. Jim Jones and Marshall Applewhite appeared to offer exactly what the decade lacked: certainty in uncertain times. Their messages, though radically different in content, operated on the same psychological wavelength. Jones promised a paradise on Earth, a community free from racism, capitalism, and cruelty. Applewhite promised a paradise beyond Earth altogether, a liberation from human limitations and a chance to evolve to a higher, purer state of existence. At their core, both appeals spoke to the same hidden ache inside thousands of followers, the longing to be part of something that finally made sense. This chapter is not about the tragedies to come. It is about the universal vulnerability that precedes them. The moment before belief becomes doctrine, before devotion becomes dependent, and before hope becomes a tool in someone else's hands. To understand Heaven's Gate and Jonestown, we must first understand the void they stepped into, and the people who reached out for them. In the years before Jonestown became a global symbol of tragedy, Jim Jones was widely regarded as a progressive visionary, a preacher who blended Christian rhetoric with socialist ideals, racial justice, and humanitarian outreach. To understand the enormity of what would later unfold, one must begin with the paradox at Jones's core. He was both deeply compassionate and deeply controlling, a man who fed the hungry with the same hands that later enforced silence and obedience. His duality is not a footnote, it is the foundation of everything that followed. Born into poverty in rural Indiana, Jones developed an early fascination with religion, not for its spiritual promises, but for its power. He learned quickly that people would listen to a preacher in ways they would not listen to anyone else. By the late 1950s, he had built the earliest version of the People's Temple, a congregation unlike any other. At a time when racism was brutal and widespread, Jones welcomed Black and white followers into the same sanctuary, preached integration, and marched beside civil rights leaders. To many, he was a hero. To others, a radical. But within the People's Temple, another reality simmered. Jones demanded absolute loyalty. Members who questioned his decisions were publicly shamed. Those who expressed doubts were labeled traitors or tools of a corrupt outside world. And those who left were treated as enemies. It was in the temple's inner circles that Jones revealed his deepest conviction. Not that he had discovered truth, but that he was the truth. The sermons grew less about God and more about Jones himself. Miracles were staged, healings were rehearsed, confidential confessions were weaponized, and slowly, a doctrine of fear began to replace the language of hope. As the movement expanded into California during the 1960s and early 1970s, Jones's power grew exponentially. He controlled housing, employment, relationships, and finances. What began as religious fellowship hardened into a system of surveillance and control. Members worked long hours for the temple, surrendering paychecks and autonomy. Sleep deprivation became common. Jones used exhaustion to keep followers pliable and paranoia to keep them isolated. Yet even as cracks formed in the facade, the temple's achievements remained undeniable. Food programs, elder care, drug rehabilitation, community activism. The good masked the rot, and the rot hid beneath the good. What made Jones so compelling was not simply charisma, but the dangerous alchemy of idealism and ego. He was a man convinced he could build paradise, yet incapable of tolerating imperfect followers. And as his vision grew, so did the distance between who he claimed to be and who he actually was. Before he became the face of Heaven's Gate, Marshall Applewhite was not a preacher, not a cult leader, and certainly not a prophet. He was a man drifting between identities, teacher, musician, son of a Presbyterian minister, moving through life with a quiet intensity that suggested he was searching for something just out of reach. His early years were not marked by grand ambition. Instead, they carried a subtle undercurrent of dissatisfaction, a sense that ordinary life was too small, too confining, too disappointingly human. Applewhite's life took its sharpest turn in the early 1970s, following a series of personal upheavals. A failed marriage, a dismissed academic career, and a psychological crisis pushed him into a period of deep existential exploration. It was during this vulnerable phase that he met Bonnie Nettles, a nurse with a fascination for the occult and New Age spirituality. Their connection was immediate, not romantic, but profoundly symbiotic. Nettles provided spiritual structure. Applewhite provided emotional persuasion. Together, they formed the nucleus of what would eventually become Heaven's Gate. Their early teachings blended Christian eschatology, Eastern philosophy, and the growing fascination with extraterrestrial life. But the core idea was startlingly unique. Humanity, they argue, was on the verge of a cosmic upgrade. A select few would shed their human vehicles and ascend to a higher evolutionary level aboard an extraterrestrial craft. This belief was not presented as metaphor or symbolism. It was direct, literal, and urgent. Applewhite, adopting the name Do, positioned himself not as a savior, but as a guide, someone who had already begun shedding earthly attachments. His demeanor was calm, almost fragile, yet his message carried conviction. Followers described him as gentle, soft-spoken, and strangely reassuring. In contrast to Jim Jones's fiery dominance, Applewhite ruled through vulnerability, offering not threats of punishment but promises of transcendence. Heaven's Gate's earliest followers were not loners or outcasts. They were intelligent, educated, and spiritually curious. Many had backgrounds in computer programming, science, and academia. They were drawn to Applewhite's vision not because it was outlandish, but because it offered clarity in a world growing more chaotic and disenchanted with traditional religion. The movement grew slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. There were no mass rallies, no political campaigns, no confrontations with the world. Instead, Applewhite built a community defined by discipline, simplicity, and purpose. He stripped followers of ego, identity, and attachments, teaching them that humanity itself was a temporary costume. For Applewhite, the Earth was never home. It was a training ground, a way station. And as his teachings evolved, so too did the idea that to reach the next level, one must be willing, one day, to leave the human body behind. Long before Jonestown became synonymous with tragedy, it existed as an idea, a dream Jim Jones carried with him long before the jungle, long before Guyana, long before the final day. Jones believed that the only way to build true equality was to construct a world completely separate from the systems he claimed were poisoned beyond repair. America, he said, was collapsing under racism, greed, and corruption. To escape it, the People's Temple would have to build their own Eden. And in 1977, Jones found the soil in which to plant it, a remote patch of jungle in northwest Guyana. To those who first arrived, the land seemed impossibly humid, impossibly dense, impossibly wild. Yet it also felt like freedom. Members worked from sunrise to sunset, clearing brush, building cabins, digging irrigation lines, planting crops. Sweat-soaked labor became a badge of honor, the proof that paradise was being built with their own hands. Families lived together, meals were shared in communal halls, and children played under the canopy of enormous trees. The early arrivals wrote home about a new life, a hopeful life, far from the tension and politics back in the United States. But beneath that hopeful veneer, Jonestown was already drifting towards something more rigid and controlling. Jones's health was deteriorating. Addiction to barbiturates left him paranoid, agitated, increasingly delusional. He spoke more often of enemies, external and internal, ready to destroy the community. As the population grew to nearly 1,000, the isolation that once felt protective now became suffocating. The loudspeakers broadcasting Jones's voice day and night ensured no one forgot the message. The outside world is the enemy. Only I can save you. Life in Jonestown was structured to limit independent thought. Workdays stretched to 16 hours. Visitors were monitored. Medical decisions required Jones's approval. Members were encouraged to report one another for disloyal attitudes. The community's most vulnerable, children, the elderly, and those without families, became the least able to resist. Fear replaced fellowship, and Jones's vision of equality dissolved into authoritarian rule. Even so, many residents clung to the dream that brought them there. The jungle had become home. Leaving felt unthinkable. Others, trapped by circumstance or coercion, carried silent dread behind forced smiles. A few desperately sought escape, only to find that passports were confiscated and the perimeter was guarded. By late 1978, Jonestown was no longer a utopia. It was a closed system orbiting one man's unraveling mind. And as Jones tightened his grip, the community he built with such hope was edging toward a fate that no one yet dared to imagine. While Jonestown was carving its utopia out of the Guyanese jungle, another community, quieter, smaller, but equally committed, was forming its own version of paradise, not in isolation from society, but in deliberate separation from its values. Heaven's Gate did not flee the world geographically, it withdrew psychologically. Its followers lived in suburban neighborhoods, rented modest homes, and blended into the background of ordinary American life. Yet inside those walls, they were preparing for something far more radical than political revolution. They were preparing for departure. Life in Heaven's Gate was governed by structure, gentle, meticulous, almost monastic. The group adopted a strict regimen that erased individuality and replaced it with uniform purpose. Clothing was standardized, hairstyles were cropped short, personal possessions were surrendered. The aim was not humiliation, but purification. Followers believed the human body was merely a vehicle, a temporary container that must be disciplined and transcended. Daily tasks, from cooking to cleaning to computer work, were performed with a quiet, almost reverent precision. The group maintained a lucrative web design business, one of the earliest in the emerging digital age, which provided financial sustainability. In contrast to the political activism and public outreach of the People's Temple, Heaven's Gate existed largely in the shadows, engaging with the outside world only when necessary. Their mission was inward, upward, and ultimately otherworldly. Marshall Applewhite, Do, guided his members not through intimidation, but through conviction. His authority came from sincerity, even fragility. He talked openly about doubt, about the difficulty of shedding human desires, about the sacrifice required for ascension. This vulnerability made him relatable, approachable. Where Jim Jones demanded loyalty through fear, Applewhite inspired devotion through shared struggle. But the discipline within Heaven's Gate was no less absolute. Members practiced renunciation with intensity, sexual abstinence, emotional restraint, the relinquishing of personal ambition. Some even chose voluntary castration, believing sexual desire was a barrier to spiritual transformation. This was not forced, it was embraced as a painful but noble step toward the next level. The group's worldview evolved with the changing cultural landscape. As astronomical discoveries filled headlines and science fiction captured collective imagination, Heaven's Gate positioned itself at the intersection of spirituality and cosmic possibility. They believed extraterrestrial beings monitored humanity, that Earth was a garden for soul development, and that a celestial event would one day signal it was time to leave.
By the mid-1990s, the members lived in a small mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, California, a quiet, orderly household that outsiders described as polite, calm, even pleasant. But inside, preparations were underway for the journey they had anticipated for decades. The Hale-Bopp comet was approaching, and for Heaven's Gate, it was not a celestial coincidence. It was a sign.
Every belief system has a moment when it either stabilizes or fractures, a moment when doubt slips in or conviction hardens into something irreversible. For Jonestown and Heaven's Gate, these turning points did not erupt suddenly. They accumulated quietly, layer by layer, until the pressure could no longer be contained. What followed were two diverging paths, one shaped by external scrutiny, the other by cosmic prophecy, yet both spiraling toward the same fatal end. For Jonestown, the breaking point began not with ideology, but with a knock on the door. In November 1978, U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan, responding to allegations of abuse and coercion within the People's Temple, announced he would visit the settlement. For Jim Jones, this was not simply a political inquiry, it was an existential threat. Ryan represented the outside world Jones had warned his followers about, the enemy he insisted would destroy their paradise. As the congressman's arrival drew near, Jones's rhetoric intensified. He spoke endlessly of conspiracies, of impending attacks, of betrayal lurking in every shadow. The community, exhausted and isolated, absorbed these messages with growing fear. Ryan's visit exposed cracks that had long been hidden. Some residents whispered their desire to leave, others begged for protection. And while many insisted Jonestown was their chosen home, the presence of armed guards and the palpable anxiety in the air told a different story. When Ryan attempted to escort a small group of defectors out, Jones concluded that his revolution had reached the point of no return. Heaven's Gate's turning point was more ethereal. Unlike the political pressure crushing Jonestown, this shift emerged from the cosmos itself. The Hale-Bopp comet, one of the most spectacular astronomical events of the century, began its highly publicized approach in the mid-1990s. For most of the world, it was a celestial wonder. For Marshall Applewhite and his followers, it was the long-awaited sign, the moment proving that their teachings were true. Inside the Rancho Santa Fe home, excitement mingled with a profound sense of destiny. Applewhite believed a spacecraft trailed behind the comet, concealed from ordinary detection, waiting to transport his followers to the next level. As media reports circulated, some legitimate, some speculative, Heaven's Gate interpreted them as divine confirmation. The veil between belief and reality grew thinner, and Applewhite's teachings intensified. He spoke with greater urgency, framing the comet not as a symbol, but as a doorway. For both communities, these turning points acted as catalysts. In Jonestown, external interference accelerated an already unstable regime. In Heaven's Gate, celestial prophecy crystallized decades of preparation. Two worlds, one earthly, one cosmic, were now moving steadily toward their irreversible destinies. The final moments of a belief system, once rooted in hope, community, and purpose, rarely arrive with a dramatic announcement. More often, they unfold like a slow eclipse, darkening gradually until night simply prevails. For both Jonestown and Heaven's Gate, the concluding chapter began with a leader convinced that there was no longer a path forward inside the world they inhabited, and in both cases, that belief became a command. In Jonestown, the atmosphere on November 18, 1978, was charged with a tension that everyone felt but few dared to articulate. Earlier that day, a group of temple defectors attempting to leave with Congressman Leo Ryan were ambushed at a nearby airstrip. The attack, ordered by Jones, left Ryan and 4 others dead. It was an act that sealed Jonestown's fate. With the United States government certain to respond, Jones framed the inevitable consequences as an apocalyptic assault. "They will come for us," he declared. "They will torture our children. There is no future left." What followed was not chaos, but choreography. Jones summoned the community to the pavilion, the heart of Jonestown, and spoke to them as though delivering a farewell sermon. His voice trembled between urgency and resignation as he argued that revolutionary suicide was the only escape from the cruelty of the outside world. Parents were urged to bring their children forward first.
Some walked with numbed obedience, others trembling. A few protested, their cries swallowed by the pressure of armed guards and the inertia of a crowd caught in psychological collapse. The cup, the syringe, the metal tub filled with poison, these became the instruments of a tragedy that fused coercion with desperation. Some drank willingly out of loyalty, others were forced. Many had no idea how to resist. And as the poison spread through the community, the jungle fell into a haunting, irreversible silence. Heaven's Gate's final sequence was markedly different, ritualistic, calm, and eerily serene. In late March 1997, Applewhite gathered his followers for what he described as their graduation. Members donned identical black clothing, new Nike shoes, and purple shrouds, uniforms symbolizing unity, discipline, and readiness. They filmed farewell messages, speaking with a conviction that suggested not fear, but fulfillment. The ingestion of the phenobarbital mixture was carried out in shifts. Each small group prepared the next, laying out their coverings, arranging their belongings, and ensuring the process remained orderly. There were no weapons, no threats, no frantic voices. What unfolded was a meticulously prepared ritual shaped by decades of belief that leaving the human body was not death, but ascension. In Jonestown, death came through pressure and force. In Heaven's Gate, it came through conviction and calm. But in both, the final orders were rooted in the same fatal truth. The moment a leader's vision becomes unquestionable, followers can be led anywhere, even beyond life itself.
The world outside Jonestown and Rancho Santa Fe woke to shock, disbelief, and incomprehension. In Guyana, the air hung heavy with the scent of decay and the echo of over 900 lives lost. The images of the jungle, bodies sprawled on the ground, children in the arms of parents, etched themselves into global memory. News reports poured in, detailing the chaos, the forced poisonings, the armed guards, and the meticulously planned deaths. For Americans and the international community, Jonestown was an unimaginable horror. For survivors, it was a combination of terror, guilt, and bewildering grief. Many had fled at the last moment or been absent that day, yet the trauma followed them relentlessly. The question that haunted everyone was the same: how could ordinary people be led to commit or submit to such acts? Investigations and congressional hearings followed, examining the psychological mechanisms of control, coercion, and fear that had permeated the People's Temple. Experts analyzed Jones's methods: the isolation, the surveillance, the manipulations of loyalty and paranoia. Journalists sought narratives of blame, redemption, or simple explanation, but no report could fully capture the human tragedy, the depth of trust betrayed, the lives extinguished under the guise of salvation. Meanwhile, across the United States, the story of Heaven's Gate unfolded in a different way. There was no immediate chaos, no jungle massacre. Instead, there was a quiet, methodical revelation: 39 bodies, neatly arranged, each clothed identically, a community choosing to depart with calm resolve. The media oscillated between fascination and ridicule, portraying the followers as naive, eccentric, or delusional. Yet experts warned that what appeared serene was the culmination of decades-long psychological conditioning, a carefully constructed ideology that framed death as evolution rather than loss. Both events forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about faith, obedience, and the human yearning for meaning. Jonestown demonstrated the lethal potential of fear, coercion, and absolute authority. Heaven's Gate illustrated how meticulous indoctrination and shared belief could lead to voluntary death with eerie composure. The differences in method, chaotic versus ritualized, did little to mitigate the similarity of outcome: lives surrendered in the name of a higher promise. For the survivors, scholars, and observers, the aftermath was not only about grief, but also about lessons. How vulnerable are humans to persuasion when hope and fear intertwine? How this community, trust, and authority shape choices in life and in death. Jonestown and Heaven's Gate became case studies in manipulation, belief, and the dark side of devotion, reminding the world that paradise promised by a charismatic leader can mask a descent into tragedy. And in the silence left behind, the question lingers:
What is the cost of absolute faith when placed in the wrong hands?
At first glance, Jonestown and Heaven's Gate could not have appeared more different. One was a sprawling, humid settlement carved from the Guyanese jungle, teeming with families and children, a mess of humanity struggling to survive under the weight of a charismatic tyrant. The other was a quiet California mansion, meticulously clean, populated by a small group of adults dressed identically, their lives regimented, their departure calm and deliberate. The contrasts are striking: chaos versus order, coercion versus willing compliance, earthly utopia versus celestial escape. Yet beneath the surface lies a startling convergence, an anatomy of control, devotion, and fatal consequence that mirrors itself in both tragedies. Both movements began with promise, a longing, meaning, and a vision of a better world. Followers were drawn by hope, not fear, at least initially. Jim Jones spoke of equality, sanctuary, and a utopia free from societal injustice. Marshall Applewhite offered liberation from earthly limitations, a chance to ascend to a higher plane of existence. In each case, the leaders exploited universal human needs: the longing for purpose, the craving for community, the desire to feel chosen or special. The psychological undercurrents were remarkably similar, even if the trappings differed. Isolation became the tool of control. Jonestown was geographically remote, a fortress against external influence. Heaven's Gate withdrew psychologically, turning suburban homes into self-contained spaces where outside ideas were filtered or discarded entirely. Both methods served the same function: to shield followers from alternative perspectives, reinforcing the leader's authority and reducing the possibility of dissent. The final acts of each group reveal an even deeper parallel. In Jonestown, coercion and fear forced participation, especially among children and vulnerable members. In Heaven's Gate, rigorous indoctrination and shared belief enabled voluntary participation, executed with precision and calm. Chaos versus order, force versus consent, these surface differences obscure a central truth. Both communities ultimately surrendered personal autonomy to a single vision, a single will, a single promise of transcendence or salvation. The lesson is hauntingly consistent. When ideology, isolation, and charisma converge, the ordinary becomes extraordinary, and devotion can override instinct, reason, and survival. Jonestown and Heaven's Gate, separated by decades and continents, demonstrate the same principle. Belief, when manipulated by a compelling authority, can lead human beings to surrender everything, even their lives. In examining these parallels, one sees not just tragedy, but a mirror held up to the human psyche, a reflection of hope, fear, and the dangerous power of absolute faith. The paths may differ, the methods may vary, but the destination is terrifyingly alike: the total relinquishment of choice in the pursuit of paradise. The stories of Jonestown and Heaven's Gate end in death, yet their lessons extend far beyond the immediate horror. They are cautionary tales, not only of charismatic leaders and isolated communities, but of the human mind itself, how it can be shaped, molded, and ultimately surrendered when desire, fear, and faith collide. To understand these tragedies is to confront the vulnerabilities that lie within us all, the impulses that can, under certain conditions, override reason, empathy, and survival instinct. Jonestown teaches the danger of power concentrated in the hands of a single individual, amplified by fear and isolation. Jones's followers were caught in a system where every aspect of daily life, work, food, punishment, affection, was mediated by him. Doubt was equated with betrayal. Questioning was met with surveillance or reprisal. When the outside world intervened, Jones's response was immediate and lethal. The tragedy demonstrates the extreme consequences when one person's vision becomes absolute, unchecked by community, law, or conscience. Heaven's Gate, in contrast, illustrates the subtler, insidious effect of long-term indoctrination. Applewhite did not compel through force. He cultivated devotion through belief, discipline, and ritual. Followers surrendered identity, autonomy, and ultimately life itself, not through immediate coercion, but through a lifetime of internalized ideology. Their deaths were voluntary, yet they were no less a product of manipulation.
It is a sobering reminder that the mind can be trained to see the impossible as necessary and the dangerous as inevitable. Both cases illuminate the universal human longing for purpose, belonging, and transcendence. People seek meaning in communities, ideologies, and leaders who promise answers to life's most profound questions. This desire is not inherently dangerous, it is human. But when that search is exploited, when authority is absolute, critical thought suppressed, and fear or certainty weaponized, the results can be catastrophic. Beyond history and headlines, these tragedies remain deeply relevant. They challenge us to examine the structures in which we place trust, the beliefs we hold unquestioned, and the pressures that can distort reason. They remind us that paradise promised by another is never neutral. It is filtered through the desires, fears, and ambitions of those who claim to lead. Narrator, VO. Jonestown and Heaven's Gate were not failures of intellect or courage. They were reflections of human hope and vulnerability, proof that the need to believe, to belong, and to transcend, when placed in the wrong hands, can become deadly. And in that reflection, we see ourselves. Fade to black. The wind rises softly. Silence.
Thank you for stopping by at Crime Era Channel. We hope you enjoyed your time here. Ensure you like and subscribe to our channel so you get notified each time we uncover another hidden crime story. Don't forget to share so your friends and family so they too can know the hidden truth.